Thanks, Steve. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I am from the southwest of England, a place called Exeter. In terms of research they do there, they do a lot of genome stuff, astrophysics. So we do have some big data that we have to shift around. One of the main problems we found was that we were trying to get some of this data into our institutional repository, which is run by some software called DSpace. Has anyone heard of DSpace? Thank you. And have you also heard of SWORD? Okay, so SWORD is a protocol that has been developed in the UK for actually interacting with any repository, and we use it with our DSpace repository. Okay, I've got about 10 slides. I'm just going to whiz through these quite quickly. So I am really going to go through them super fast, and then we should have time for a quick demo, providing the internet gods are looking down on us. Okay, so this project basically started as a result of a £1 million investment in a petabyte data store run on EMC Atmos out of some of our science strategy funding. As a result of that, we spun off another project which had some funding from one of our national funding bodies called GISC. This enabled us to recruit a full-time developer and use the rest of the resource in my team to basically work on this particular problem. One of the other elements of this project was to look at the sort of human factors in research data management, and in particular looking to see where our data was distributed. Some of the early findings told us that the data wasn't just on big machines, it was on people's local laptops and private machines and all sorts of odd places. So we needed to find a solution that would be able to pull all of this data together and submit it to our repository. Okay, so as I've mentioned, we use DSpace. One of the key limitations of DSpace was that out of the box, it doesn't really have a decent method of uploading data into it. It uses real-time upload via HTTP, which is clearly not going to work when we're talking in terms of terabytes of data. One of the things DSpace did have, which was a bit of a lifeline to us, was the ability to do something called submit by reference, which means that you get the files onto the file system and effectively provide pointers to that data. Okay, so the Globus connection. As I said, we'd already kind of found our problem. Large volumes of data needing to be reliably transferred from multiple locations, both sort of geographically and virtually. So Globus starts ticking some of the boxes that we need. It's free-ish. Efficient, resilient, secure, open API, and cloud-based service. These were great things that we saw in being able to work with it. Also based on proven grid FTP and also trusted by researchers. Okay, some of the initial limitations we found in working with Globus were, none of these were showstoppers, but authentication was our first key thing. We're very set on trying to make sure that our users authenticate directly to Exeter. Passing authentication over via a third party is a bit of a no-no in any context. We looked at federation. We've got the equivalent to In Common in the UK. It's called the UK Access Management Federation, and it uses Shibboleth. We looked at using that first, but in the end, it turned out that we didn't really need to go down that route. I'll talk about that in a bit. The other thing we wanted to address was really the service needed to look and feel like it was very much part of our DSpace repository. We didn't really want to be jumping out to Globus and jumping back in again. Okay, one of the key limitations in the first instance that we had to work with the guys here to solve was the ability to monitor transfers other than those belonging to the user, because the way in which we were going to use Globus was to effectively fire and forget, and the user would have disappeared by the time we came to actually monitor the transfer. So this isn't like a user going to the user interface and seeing whether my transfer is finished yet. It needed to happen automatically and programmatically. Okay, so Globus has worked with us from the start to understand our requirements and create new functionality where needed. Key elements around authentication, we were put in touch with the CI logon team, and Jim Basney gave us a great helping hand to move that forward and gave us some code, and we eventually clicked on what we needed to do there. So that's a key part of our solution now. We also had to do some local customizations of DSpace and Sword, which we're now feeding back into that open source community, and are being received very well. Okay, Sword itself, it's a very lightweight protocol for depositing content from one location to another. It's repository agnostic, open source, and generally has been funded by JISC in the UK. We actually worked with one of the key developers of that protocol to fix some bits that weren't going to work for us initially. So again, we've had to reach out to other groups in order to get the solution that you're going to see in place. Okay, so I'm going to go through now and do a demo. This is the basic use case that demo's really covering. So our end user is going to log into the repository using a single sign-on system, start a submission. If this is their first time, they must register with Globus to do that. They will automatically log into Globus and the submission tool. They'll choose a collection, and then they'll enter some metadata. If you haven't really got the concept of the repository, it really both serves as an archive to secure the data long term, typically for funding body mandates and such like, and also for open access to be able to make the data available to other people and other groups. Okay, we'll go on and create a new endpoint if required, select that endpoint, and then push some files across to transfer. Once the user logs out, they then get notified via progress, much like Globus does, but the progress is done via our application in the form of email. It's a quick breakdown of the architecture. Kind of shows Globus at the middle of it, but also shows the SSO and OAuth my proxy elements, which are fairly key to us. Okay, so without further ado, let's see whether we can get a demo. So this is what our repository looks like. Not particularly bells and whistles or exciting, but it basically breaks things down into communities and collections. It's browsable, but it's typically searched via Google and has persistent handles or digital object identifiers to each item within the repository. If I log into the repository, we'll get routed through to our core single sign-on system. And we're now in a position to be able to submit an item to the repository. Click on Submit. And we're kind of at the point now where we're starting to interact with Globus. And when I click on Start a Submission now, in the background here, there's going to be an authentication to the OAuth my proxy server, and also to into Sword and into our underlying repository. Okay, so first thing to note is it knows who I am. It's presented a set of collections for which I am entitled to submit. I will choose the one at the top. Okay, at this point we're going to fill in some metadata which describes the the data that we're going to submit today. Let's call this live demo. Choose a date. And I think that is probably it for the mandatory metadata that's required. I'll just skim through the next. Okay, so at this point, we've actually hit our kind of Globus interaction now. You'll notice that we've got some filtering here, which allows us to show, by default, our personal endpoints. So these are typically GCs running on your laptop or your desktop somewhere. Or also looking at all of the Exeter endpoints. Because we've got a very set use case here where we've got a fixed target destination, but variable source destinations. We're really only interested in stuff that's coming from Exeter at this stage. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this endpoint. This is my desktop back in Exeter. Hopefully, it'll be running. So you'll notice here that we've actually developed our own file picker. That's mainly because at this stage, the ability to use the file pickers from Globus Online means that it doesn't look well integrated in that the user ends up having to bounce around a little bit. So we went down the road of actually implementing our own. So the Globus API here is going and listing the files for you, looking at the modification times, and giving you the opportunity to traverse directories and then select files or directories. If I choose something here, and I will just grab a couple of small files. So I've selected 3 files. That's pretty much it at this stage. We have the opportunity to encrypt the data. It's in the sense that this is going to be an open access repository, and the data is going to be publicly available anyway. That doesn't matter that much. But there are contexts sometimes where we want to embargo data or hide it for a short amount of time. So it may well be that that's more relevant then. We also have the ability to verify the checksum. I'll leave that off for now for the purposes of the demo, as it'll add to the overall time. We click Finish, and our transfer should kick off, and we should have a placeholder in the repository. You'll notice an email pops up telling me that something's happening, that the transfer's been accepted and that it's going ahead. I will now try and catch it mid-transfer. So you'll notice at no stage have I've been prompted specifically for authentication to Globus. That's because that's all hidden via our single sign-on system, and all appears pretty seamless. If I look at transfer activity, we should see that taking place. You'll also notice that we attach a label to the transfer that reflects the title of the submission that we entered within the metadata. That's very useful from an end user point of view because it's something we can reference in emails and say to them, if there's a problem, then tell us about it. Okay, so if I just show you the email that comes through, the first email basically indicating that the file transfer started also gives the user some information about making sure that they don't shut their endpoint down. Again, bear in mind if this is a GC on your laptop, you could just turn around and flip your laptop down and walk away, and the transfer is not going to work then. So there's a bit of information in there that allows us to educate the users on what they've got to do in order for this to work. Okay, if we just drop back. I can now look at submissions that I've made to the repository. Oh, and there's our step 2 of 4, telling me that the transfer succeeded. And we should get a step 3 shortly that tells us that it's gone into the repository as well. There we go. I'll just refresh that page. Okay, so the repository has, by default, an approval workflow where typically subject librarians or research supervisors will look at submissions and make sure they've got the correct metadata with them and that everything checks out. So you can see that's where my submission has now landed with our live demo transfer. And that is pretty much it. I know that was a flying visit. It's beautiful in its simplicity, we like to think. And that's a good example of really embedding Globus in an application, I believe, using all of the tools that you make available to us, thankfully. Okay.
All right. Any questions?
That's pretty much it. Yeah. Any questions?
For Lee?
So I had 2 questions, I guess. One is for the integrity verification, when you submitted it, I mean, yes, turned off for purposes of demo, fine. Is that on by default?
It would normally be. It would normally be, yes.
Okay.
Again, because we're running a fire and forget service, in a sense, it doesn't matter to the end user most of the time, because they're just going to get these notification emails when everything's done what needs to be done. So although it does tend to kind of double the total time required, you know, we're okay with it.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yes. And I should say that as all the data sets that we all deal with get much larger, we've seen circumstances where the integrity checksum is in fact really valuable.
Yeah.
And it's the only means of preventing otherwise silent data corruption.
Yes.
Right. And that happens anywhere from disk controller all the way to failing network hardware.
It may well be that that doesn't even appear as an option on the live service, you know, eventually. For what we're doing at the moment, and particularly for demos like this, it's great to be able to just flick it on and off.
Oh, yeah, sure. I was delighted to see it, though. And
yeah.
I was just curious if you were going to turn on by default. The other question I had was about your decision to do a custom, to do your own file selection interface.
Yes.
And sort of how easy or difficult was that to implement? Because we've gone back and forth with some communities on you know, they have interface nits that they pick,
yeah.
Right? And you know, and I'm just, you know, this is me acting as an ambassador to some science collaboration somewhere, and I'm trying to help them get their kit set up. Sometimes I just don't want to know what the level of effort is to do something like that. So we
were in a position where we'd already done some development of our own file picker before we'd even chosen Globus as the vehicle. So we'd already, you know, we'd already got some code that we could use like that, and then it was just a case of plugging the Globus API into that. And I think we felt at this stage that that was the right thing to do. I mean, we did look at using the file picker, and we did have some prototypes where we did kind of bounce around with it and go out to the file picker and come back into the application, and it just didn't feel right for the time being.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
quick thing to jump in on that, right? So what he's referring to is in Globus, on our branded pages, we do have what we call our picker page, where you can redirect to it, pick something and redirect back, but for the much more integrated feel. I'll mention tomorrow a little bit, one of the features we're thinking about is taking some of our web components and making them more widgets so that they can be more directly embedded in. That's still downstream. And then a comment on the verification, when we did a bunch of performance testing on this, we recently turned this on default on Globus Online precisely because of the comments that Eli made. And one of the things we found is it depends a lot on whether it's one file or a bunch of files, because we're able to background do checksums at the same time as previous transfers. So you see a lot more cost when it's one file than a bunch of them.
Yeah.
So, just so people are aware. Any other questions? Take one more if anybody's got it. All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and I think next up is David Skinner. Get the laptop switched over here.
Unplug this before you plug that in. That goes first. That goes in your